Recently, I met up with Adam Wood, the author and publisher of Swanson, The Life and Times of a Victorian Detective. We took a stroll through the streets of Westminster, where the Metropolitan Police were and are based. Adam told me all about the life and the times of a detective who really doesn't get the credit he is due for his involvement with the Jack the Ripper case. Here is the interview. So testing, 1, 2, 3. So I'm out here. I'm on a little wander around Whitechapel. I'm on a wander around Whitehall with Adam Wood, and we're just walking through Scotland Place, Scotland Yard, which was Metropolitan Police territory. And Adam's the author of the book on Swanson. What's it called again, Adam?
The Life and Times of a Victorian Detective.
Swanson, The Life and Times of a Victorian Detective. And you're going to talk all about Sir Charles Warren now, right? No. We're going to talk all about Swanson. So first of all, who was Swanson?
Well, Donald Swanson was born, first of all, it's important to know where his background was. He was born in the far north of Scotland by John O'Groats. Very important to realise that this wasn't, we're not talking about Glasgow or Edinburgh or any of those large cities or towns. It was literally a farm of 2 houses and a distillery. His father was a brewer and a distiller, and he was born the youngest son of 6. And the family grew up in Thurso, which is the most northerly town in Britain. He began life as a student teacher, which meant basically he was still 16 years old, still receiving an education, but acted as the teacher to the infants of the school, the Miller Institution in Thurso, under the direction of James Waters. But for some reason, one reason or another, one time he was 19, he decided to leave Thurso and went to London, where his sister had already settled after marrying a fireman in the West End by Piccadilly. It was not quite sure whether Swanson was a bit dispirited with his life as a teacher up in Thurso, or whether he was looking to support the family, because his sister Mary's husband had died at that time, 2 weeks before she had just given birth to the youngest of 3 children. So perhaps he moved to London to support the family, and found job as a city clerk, working for a relative, Mr. John Mickle, who was a relative of one of his former teachers, Robert Mickle. And that's what he was doing in 1868 when John Mickle decided to give up business. He was an older man, returned to Manchester, and Donald Swanson was faced with a choice of trying to find work or returning back to Scotland. Literally, according to his application to the Metropolitan Police, he was looking through the Daily Telegraph of that day, saw an advert seeking candidates for the Met, and wrote to apply to become a constable. He's 19 years old, and he was accepted. He became a police constable assigned to A Division, specifically King Street Station, which is just around the corner from where we are now. And 2 weeks after he was positioned there, there was quite a famous murder actually in Met Archives of Sergeant Daniel Badstrop. He was stabbed in the neck by a prisoner and bled to death 2 days later. So if Swanson was any doubt that the life of a police constable was different to the city clerk, he didn't have to wait very long to find out, really. Yeah. But he worked his way up, Swanson worked his way up through sergeant, inspector, detective sergeant, detective inspector, chief inspector, all the way through to detective superintendent at Scotland Yard of the CID. He was, at that point, the top detective in the country, in charge of the CID at Scotland Yard. And he retired in 1903 after 35 years service. A very successful career with quite a few famous cases.
And of course, one of the most famous cases he would have been involved with was Jack the Ripper, or the Whitechapel Murders, to be pedantic about it. And so, what was his involvement with the Jack the Ripper investigation?
Well, it's quite interesting, Richard, because generally up until probably the 1980s, nobody knew anything about Swanson, and obviously people know very little about his police career. They certainly will if they buy my book. But until the 1980s, nobody knew the name of Swanson with involvement in the Ripper case. Everyone thinks it's Frederick Aberline, who obviously was in charge of the case on the ground at Whitechapel. former Whitechapel Detective and 8th Division. But Swanson was appointed on the day of Annie Chapman's murder by Sir Charles I, the Commissioner, to be the eyes and ears of the Commissioner running the case from Scotland Yard. So every report from 8th Division and all the other investigative channels came to Scotland Yard. Swanson was responsible for sorting through those and identifying investigation leads, sending people to interview suspects and potential witnesses. So Swanson really had probably the most central position in the case, but until the 1980s, when or the late 70s certainly, when researchers could access the files, people probably weren't aware of his involvement at all, because they were judging by newspaper reports, which obviously were focusing on the investigation in Whitechapel, which is why Aberline is such a prominent name in the newspapers and the case for people. But Swanson certainly was probably, more than anyone, knew what was going on in the investigation, what the different strands were, who the different suspects were, and giving direction to Superintendent Arnold at Whitechapel 8th Division, and to, say, Aberline, who was seconded from Scotland Yard to assist on Whitechapel. But probably Swanson knew more than anyone, I would say.
So although he outranked Aberline, he was a higher rank than
Swanson at that point had been, in January of 1888, he'd been appointed Chief Inspector Temporary. Aberline was still Inspector. It wasn't until December of early part of 1889 that Swanson was appointed Chief Inspector Permanent, and Aberline was promoted in his place as Chief Inspector Temporary. So Aberline had been in the, and it's no disrespect to Aberline, but Swanson's career, he'd been mostly serving in Central Office at Scotland Yard. He'd risen through the ranks and became Chief Inspector before Aberline, although Aberline was several years older and served with the police for several years. Or Aberline was more of a divisional inspector. But Swanson outranked him. They had worked together in the early 1870s when they both were working in Highgate together, and there's one famous case, infamous case I should say, where they went on plainclothes duty investigating one particular case in a theatre. I don't want to give too much away because it's, again, worth reading the book, but it's interesting. 17 years before the Whitechapel murders, Swanson as a PC and Aberline as a sergeant did work together investigating one particular case. It was probably only 2 weeks worth of work, but it's interesting they did know each other well before the Ripper investigation. So there's no question that although Swanson outranked Aberline, there was any jealousy or any bitterness about it. They were professional detectives and they just worked together as they needed to.
Okay. So it's safe to say that Aberline would have known the local picture on the ground, the investigation in Whitechapel.
I think that's absolutely right, because Aberline had worked for many years as a local inspector in Whitechapel. He'd been promoted, as I say, to Central Office at Scotland Yard, but when the Whitechapel murders obviously became a series, Aberline was seconded back to Whitechapel because he knew the area, probably knew a lot of the criminal activity that was going on, so he could advise the police. He was effectively the link between Scotland Yard and Whitechapel. That's why when you look at many of the reports, they're statements and interviews, they're conducted by Aberline. But again, those statements would have been submitted to Swanson for assimilation into the Scotland Yard investigation.
So Swanson would have had the big picture.
Indeed.
So he would have had the overview of the entire case.
Yes, absolutely.
Whereas Aberline would have had the view of the local case.
Absolutely.
On the ground.
I don't doubt that Aberline had some feedback from Scotland Yard and Swanson, but I mean, there were different strands of investigation coming. Aberline was the main one with Superintendent Arnold from Whitechapel. Those reports were going in, but Swanson would have had all the different strands from all the different divisions. Obviously J Division was involved early on in the investigation, so that again, Aberline was involved in that.
And that's because that's where Mary Nichols was murdered.
Absolutely right. So Swanson had, as you say, Richard, Swanson had the overall picture perhaps that was going on in the whole investigation into all the murders, and potentially, and apart from his reports, his consolidation reports to the Home Office and to his superiors, he probably was the only officer that knew everything that was going on.
And we're exploring the streets where he was based. We're in Whitehall, where he was based.
Absolutely right. When he first joined the Met, as I said a moment ago, he was in A Division for 4 years, working at King Street, where he learnt his craft, and he was PC pounding the beat, and obviously, tend to pound the beat in people realising, thinking about the Ripper murders, they're thinking about Whitechapel and those sort of poverty-stricken streets and things. But obviously, Westminster's a very different area, and I think the PC pounding the beat around Downing Street, because King Street was, though it's demolished now, it was parallel to Downing Street. And it's where all the local government authority buildings are, and it's quite well to do.
Yeah.
I'm sure that Swanson probably walked around Trafalgar Square more than once on his beat and that sort of thing. So, yeah, and I think that probably it's quite interesting, because one thing people don't realise about Swanson, think that he was a Westminster PC and then a chief inspector in Scotland Yard. He was out of touch with the East End. But of course that wasn't the case, because when he left King Street station in A Division, he was transferred to West Ham, and he served in Mile End. And in his early career, he actually had 2 or 3 warnings and cautions. He was fined for being late on roll call, being seen outside a particular pub in Stepney Green, although he was on duty without his armlet on. So he did know Mile End and Whitechapel well before the Whitechapel murders. He absolutely did, yeah.
Yeah. So into the picture then comes, of course, it would have been his direct superior would have been Dr. Robert Anderson, Robert Anderson, and he was the assistant commissioner.
That's right.
And the head of the CID, the Criminal Investigation Department, and they worked together. Repeatedly, they're very good friends as well. But Anderson, of course, was away at the time of the Ripper murders to begin with. He'd been sent on sick leave, hadn't he?
That's right. But I think at that point, probably in the early to mid 1880s, Swanson had been identified by Frederick Williamson, Superintendent or Chief Constable Williamson.
Yeah. So this is Dolly.
Dolly Williamson. He was obviously the top.
Yeah.
Detective, I would say, and obviously he had a long career. I don't know whether he spotted something in Swanson or what. I mean, there's obituaries of Swanson that said something was spotted by Williamson in the young Scot to bring him under his wing. But certainly he did serve a number of cases with the Fenian bombings of the 1880s, the Trafalgar Square riots of 1887. He assisted Williamson on a lot of those investigations in the mid-1880s, where Williamson was the lead investigator, but Swanson was obviously with him almost as his right-hand man. They went to Ireland to arrest Michael Davitt, all this sort of thing. So there was definitely a suggestion and some evidence that Swanson was being groomed or raised to be a senior officer long before Robert Anderson was appointed as commissioner after James Monroe had resigned. But when Annie Chapman was murdered in September 1888, Commissioner Sir Charles Warren issued a memorandum that appointed Swanson to be in charge of the case. Now, people have wondered why that may well have been. Well, why did he choose Swanson over anybody else? There were some very, very capable chief inspectors in Scotland Yard at the time, but my feeling is that because of Swanson's work with Williamson, Charles Warren approached Dolly Williamson and said, well, we need someone in Scotland Yard who's going to be representing us. Who do you recommend? And Williamson naturally said Donald Swanson. So although Anderson was away on holiday, and I don't know what relationship was between Swanson and Anderson in those early days, I suspect that Williamson appointed Swanson, and when Anderson returned from holiday, found Swanson in that position and picked up the case from him.
So Anderson comes back off holiday, and then obviously the murders continue. So we get we get Mary Kelly, and then of course Anderson becomes almost infamous because of his memoirs.
Indeed, yes.
And in those memoirs, it's when he actually gives us the hint. Or not just the hint, he gives us the statement that the Whitechapel murderer, or Jack the Ripper, was a low-born Polish Jew living in the heart of the area. Doesn't name him. And this is where Swanson then comes back into the picture, isn't it, as far as Jack the Ripper is concerned?
Well, Swanson as I said, Swanson was unknown to Ripper researchers for many, many years because his name wasn't in the papers as Abberline was. But when basically when he retired, or during his retirement, I should say, it seems that he collected police memoirs and other criminal-related magazines and things. He certainly never wrote his own memoirs, and according to his grandson, Jim Swanson, who did know him, he was completely adverse to telling anything about his career, even to the family. He didn't say what happened, but they were aware that he'd worked on the Ripper case, and they were aware that he apparently knew the identity of the killer, but he wouldn't divulge anything. After he died, all his collection of police memoirs and other materials passed to his widow Julia. She died in the 1930s, and all the documents then passed to the two daughters, Alice and Ada. They kept it. They moved out of London in 1945 when the family home was hit by warm damage. So they moved out to Dunstable, which is obviously outside of London, and they lived there till 1980 when they both died in their 1990s. And at that point, the cottage, the home called Orchard Cottage, had to be cleared out before the property could be sold. And at that point, Jim Swanson, the grandson of Donald, was the executor of the will. He took possession. They said they didn't have apparently time to look through all the possessions before the property had to be sold, so they just emptied the house and brought it back to Jim's house, and then put the property on the market. And it was only several months later, when they were looking through the materials, there was obviously family furniture and possessions which were distributed among the family members, but Jim had apparently a lifelong interest in criminal matters. He staked a claim to the criminal matters of his grandfather, shall we say. And it was only later that they were going through various materials, and they found a number of books where there are pencil marginalia in, and it's probably people know about the so-called Swanson marginalia, which we'll come into in a moment, but many people don't realise that there's more than one instance of that. It's not just Anderson's memoirs. There's books by former Inspector John Sweeney, who worked on the Special Branch in the Fenian matters. Donald Swanson has written marginal notes in his copy of that autobiography, and various other books. So, you know, it's not a one-off instance. It's not an unusual thing.
So he, almost like a hobby, he had to have a word on it.
Yeah, he didn't write his own memoirs, but he was quite happy to comment on other people's, but probably for his own use, for his you know, his own knowledge was probably greater than many others on certain matters. And it's interesting on some books that, for instance, there's a famous case that he worked on about the theft of a Gainsborough painting called the Duchess of Devonshire, and in the Pinkertons, who actually were instrumental in bringing it back from America, that Swanson, as superintendent, worked with to bring it back to the owners. They wrote in their account of the theft and the discovery that it was a particular English criminal who helped with that. In his copy of the Pinkertons memoirs, Swanson's corrected it, saying no, it was a different criminal that was involved with it. So he had personal knowledge, and it wasn't unusual of him at all to either correct or add some information or something.
So he's not doing this for any financial gain. He's not any other, just for his own personal.
It's personal knowledge, and he has the ability to add something for his own library.
Yeah. And he's got no intention of publishing this or making it public.
No, there's nothing at all. There's nothing at all. Now, what the book that you mentioned is Robert Anderson's memoirs, Light Side of My Official Life. Obviously, was the published book version of a series of articles that appeared in Blackwood's magazine earlier in 1910. Now, Swanson had a copy of that book. It's doubtful that it came from Robert Anderson. It's interesting that, you know, it's been commented over the years that Anderson and Swanson were close friends. I don't think that they were as close as people have previously anticipated. Certainly, Swanson's copy of Light Side of My Official Life has a dedication to Donald, best wishes from Fred. Now, we don't yet know who Fred is. I have an idea about that. It's a theory. Doesn't really matter.
So it wasn't given to him by Anderson?
No, it wasn't from Anderson. Yeah. There are other copies of Anderson's other books, Criminals and Crime, and it's to inscribed to Swanson from Anderson.
Yeah.
So he did have personal copies presented by Anderson, but not that particular book. I don't know why, but that particular copy, Light Side of My Official Life, is sent from someone called Fred. Anyway,
it couldn't be.
It's not Aberline. It's not. Well, it could have been Aberline, but I don't think it is. I personally think it's Swanson's dentist, but that's another story.
As you do.
Now, in that book, in that copy of that book, obviously Anderson writes about the Polish Jew being caged in asylum. This is talking about Jack the Ripper, caged in asylum, and that was the end of the murders. And doesn't, as you said, he declined to mention the suspect. But Swanson, having the copy in his own study for his own personal use, he was quite happy to name what happened to the suspect and who he was, sort of thing. And obviously, he said that where Anderson wrote that the only person who ever saw the Ripper declined to identify him, Swanson gave some information and said that he knew he'd been identified at the seaside home. Don't know where yet, but I do give my theory in the book.
Here he comes now, I think.
Yeah. I think that's the lawyers from the suspect.
Oh,
yeah. Libel matters. And then, of course, Swanson says at the end papers of the book that, again, handwritten notes. He said that the suspect knew he was identified. He returned to his brother's house in Whitechapel. He was watched night and day by City CID. And in a short time, he was sent to Whitechapel Workhouse and then to Colney Hatch. Died shortly after. Kosminski was a suspect. Now, obviously, this was discovered by Jim Swanson in late 1980, should say. And then, after some consideration, because he was so proud of his grandfather's career and felt that over the years he hadn't had the recognition that perhaps he deserved because his name hadn't been in the papers as much, Jim Swanson wrote to two papers, the Sunday Express and the News of the World, offering information in the marginalia to write a story. News of the World responded first, and I sent their chief crime reporter, Charles Sandell, out to interview Jim, got the story, borrowed the marginalia and other documents that Jim had found in the meantime, and started doing some research on Kosminski. But Charles Sandell couldn't find too much on Kosminski, and as has happened in the years since, not many people have. And for one reason or another, I know Charles Sandell had a heart attack and he was taken out of work for 3 months, and he eventually retired shortly afterwards. The story never ran in News of the World. This is 1981, and it wasn't until 1987, when it was coming up for the Ripper Centenary, that there were some pieces running in the newspapers with stories such from the likes of Martin Fido and Don Rumbelow, that the Daily Telegraph ran a piece by a journalist called Charles Nevin, and Jim Swanson read it and wrote to Nevin offering the same information. And Charles Nevin did run a story this time. This is the first time that the marginalia came to the national consciousness. This is October 1987, and it was probably the first time that John Swanson's involvement in the Ripper case, the heavy involvement, first became known. Again, Charles Nevin couldn't find much about Kosminski. Martin Fido had been looking through the Colney Hatch Asylum records where Swanson said that the suspect had gone to, and found an Aaron Kosminski, who did die, but not for 20 years after Swanson said he did. So there's some doubt as to who's correct. Was Swanson misguided? Was Swanson senile and misremembered? Had he lied? Did Swanson not write the marginalia? Or was it possibly the case that Aaron Kosminski wasn't the person he was writing about? It's something which has sort of raged really since the 1980s to this day. I've got an idea as to the truth behind the matter. Several people have said that perhaps the Swanson marginalia is a fake. Why did it come to light in the 1980s when the centenary was about to spring? It was obviously going to be newsworthy. Was it going to make some money for Jim Swanson and the family? In fact, Jim Swanson didn't make any money at the story in the Telegraph. It was printed for free. He did offer the story and was paid money by the News of the World that he split with his siblings, 5 of them. But again, the story didn't run, so I don't think £50 personal investment is going to make a huge amount different in someone's life. But it was more a case of wanting his grandfather's story, or his life and career, to be recognised. Interestingly, Neville Swanson, who's Jim's son, so that's Donald's great-grandson, born after Donald died, so he never met him, he took possession of the called the marginalia, and basically all Donald Swanson's documentation after Jim died in 2002, I think it was, and decided to loan Swanson's copy of the Anderson memoirs to the Crime Museum at Scotland Yard to go on display there. Now, the Scotland Yard, the curator at that time, Alan McCormack, took advantage to have the marginalia handwriting tested by the forensic science department that the Met used at the time, a chap called Dr. Christopher Davies. This is 2006, and they had a ledger written by Donald Swanson that was also loaned to the Crime Museum by Neville. And Dr. Davies considered that, judging by the materials that he had, the marginalia, there was strong evidence that it was written by the same person. So this stayed in the Crime Museum at Scotland Yard for 6 years, available on display for those lucky people invited there. But in 2012, the Swanson family decided to collate all the different strands of material that had been around the different cousins and family members, with a view to potentially selling the collection. That's not happened, actually. In the meantime, it's decided not to sell the collection. But when the marginalia in the light side of my official life came back to the Swanson family in 2012, I was invited to access all the documentation, including the marginalia, and I got in touch with Dr. Davies, who, with a view to coming to examine it, with more papers which had been found, including personal letters by Donald Swanson to his family members, the personal address book, which has all sorts of different pencil writing and dates and all the sort of thing that people have been doubting when the test was first done. Why is the marginalia written in a grey pencil and a purple pencil? Well, the personal address book has writing in purple pencil and grey graphite pencil. It's just a pot of pencils, which I think he had on his desk over the years.
Yeah.
And the marginalia was probably written at different times rather than
so
in
he
one
just
sitting.
reached for a pencil, the one
Absolutely
closest
right.
hand.
At different times. I don't believe that it was all recorded, all written at one point. Probably, 2, 3, several years apart. And Dr. Davies, looking at this new material that was guaranteed to be written by Donald Swanson, he updated his official report to say that it was very strong evidence that it was written by Donald Swanson. Now, off the record, I asked Dr. Davies, what could we do to get guaranteed that it definitely was, and he said you would never get any document examiner to say it definitely was written by so-and-so. That's as good as you're going to get.
Yeah.
But in his opinion, there was no doubt. But officially, that was all he could write in his report. And I think that was absolutely fine, really. But it was a bit disappointing, because at the time, this was going in 2012, there was some debate on the JTR forums and Facebook forums, message boards, about the possibility that Jim Swanson had forged the marginalia to get some financial gain. So for that purpose, when I took the opportunity, because I had a large correspondence file, it's Dr. Davies' lawyers coming to...
Oh, they're coming for you now. They're lost. They're back.
Because I had a large correspondence file written by Jim Swanson. He was in the habit of making carbon copies of his letters to newspapers and other individuals. We had quite a large number of letters in the handwriting of Jim Swanson. So I asked Dr. Davies, can you compare Jim Swanson's handwriting with the handwriting in the marginalia? And his report states that there's zero evidence that they're written by the marginalia are written by Jim Swanson. When I put that in an article for Reportologist magazine, that Dr. Davies had concluded that yes, there was very strong evidence the marginalia notes were written by Donald Swanson, but zero evidence are written by Jim Swanson. I was questioned by one or two individuals who shall remain nameless. Why did I ask Dr. Davies to conduct the test against Jim Swanson's handwriting if I didn't suspect there was some evidence of foul play? And as I replied, I couldn't win. If I hadn't have done it, people said, why didn't you do the test against Jim Swanson? And when I did, why did you do it?
You're a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, it was just a case that people don't want to believe Donald Swanson, who was the officer who knew most about the Ripper investigation, might well have given the name and his personal notes about the suspect.
And he's not doing it for any... There's no real reason for him to do it.
To be honest, Richard, the marginalia notes, they were kept by the daughters Ada and Alice for 45 years effectively in a trunk in a hallway where they used to keep their linen.
Yeah.
All the documents and the marginalia was kept there, and until 1981, when Jim Swanson was going through it, nobody in the family even knew the notes were there. Yeah. So it's not as though Donald Swanson was writing them with a hope that one day someone would sell the story, there'd be a booking it. Yeah. It literally was a personal thing, and it would have been completely understandable if, when they cleared that house in the family home in 1935, when Julia Swanson died, they'd have just put everything in a skip and nobody would ever knew about it.
Yeah.
There was absolutely no intention of a personal fame or
yeah. He's not doing
gain.
It for any reason other than for his own personal knowledge or entertainment in his retirement.
Yeah, indeed.
He's got no financial motive for it. He's got no notoriety motive for it because nobody's going to see it.
Yeah,
so,
indeed,
yeah.
Indeed, yeah.
And yet he's the man, who would have known.
I think absolutely.
If they had caught Jack.
But it's interesting because again, there's another train of thought that people are saying, well, was Swanson only adding information to what Anderson said? So Anderson says, perhaps boasted that he knew the identity of the Ripper, and Swanson was just giving information on that suspect. And that's entirely possible, of course, but there's one line in the marginalia which is interesting, and talking about the murder of Mary Kelly, and Swanson writes in the margin to the left of that text saying that after the identification following this murder, no other murder of this kind took place in London. I just think it's interesting that if Swanson thought that there was a different murderer, and say someone, Francis Coles or Alice Mackenzie, later potential Ripper victims, were killed by the same hand, would he have written that line of text? No other murder of this kind took place in London.
So he's effectively saying the later ones weren't.
I think that's what he was saying, that he was agreeing with Anderson that Mary Kelly was the last so-called Ripper murder, and the possible post-Kelly murders were by another hand.
Yeah.
Now that's interesting, because if he says in the marginalia that Kosminski was a suspect, doesn't write Kosminski was a murderer, but is he saying Kosminski's a suspect because that's the terminology that Anderson's used in the Polish Jew suspect? I suspect that's the case, and I do suspect that Swanson did think that Polish Jew suspect was the killer.
Yeah. So that's interesting, because what you're saying that it's almost semantic. He's not actually saying he was the murderer. He's saying he was Anderson's suspect.
Yes. Yeah.
But you're also saying that you think that was also the murderer.
It's difficult to say. I mean, I can only go by my interpretation of Swanson's writing, and bearing in mind the research of the book has taken 6 years, and I've read literally hundreds of documents and reports, personal letters written by Swanson. I've got to know his turn of phrase, how he would have worded something. I mean, for instance, in the seaside home identification that he mentions that the suspect was recognised by a witness, most people tend to think that's the Metropolitan Police seaside home at Hove.
Yeah.
I strongly think that if that was the case, Swanson would have written. That is, again, knowing Swanson's writing style, he would have said after the suspect was identified at Hove, rather than the seaside home. So, because he's written after this murder, no other this murder took place here of this kind in London, I just believe that yes, he was saying Anderson was correct. This was the killer.
Yes. So what we've basically got here is we got the man who's the highest ranking officer on the case with direct responsibility. So this is Swanson. You've got Anderson, who's the overall honcho in charge of CID. Here he comes now. I think they are lost. They're going round again. So you've got Anderson, who writes in his memoirs that it was a low-born Polish Jew, but doesn't name him. And then Swanson comes along for no other reason than he's doing it for his own personal recollection, his own effectively entertainment, as he's sitting in his retirement, and he names that suspect as Kosminski.
Yeah, indeed. But what's interesting, I completely agree with that, but what's interesting is that Dr. Davies, when he looked at the endnotes in the marginalia, he said that, it's definitely in Swanson's handwriting. It's very strong evidence that it's in Swanson's handwriting, but in his opinion, the line Kosminski was the suspect was written slightly after the rest. Now, whether that means it's still in the same hand, but was it a case that Swanson was reluctant initially to name the suspect? Did he sort of pause for thought, I better not, or okay, I will. No one's going to see it.
And did you know how long after all?
No. It was definitely. Well, it looks as though it's on the same day. It's the same pencil. The same style of handwriting.
It wasn't like 50 years down.
But the writing. No. But the writing style. He says that he sent to Colney Hatch, where he died shortly after. Full stop. Now that looks like a natural break.
Yeah.
And in the next line, he's slightly out of kilter in terms of it's the same writing style, same pencil. But it's a little bit. It's not as though it's a natural one flow of the pencil. So it looks as though he's paused for thought. Shall I name the suspect? Okay, I will. It's for my personal
No one's going
view.
No one's ever going to see it.
Yeah. Little did he know.
Little did he know that you'd be turning up.
Well, if he, I'm sure if he knew all the furore that's gone on about Aaron Kosminski and everything that's happened since, he probably wouldn't have bothered to write that last line.
Yeah.
And then we'd all been complaining.
Do you think he'd be astonished that people are still interested in the case today?
I think absolutely right. I mean, one thing that Jim Swanson always used to write to newspapers was that Jack the Ripper was a small part of his grandfather's career, his 35-year career. He was involved he was actually arrested personally for a Mapleton, which is a internationally famous railway murder case of 1881. That was probably the case that made his name. He then went 2 weeks after Lefroy was executed. He was then sent 2 weeks later to Aberdeen to investigate a body snatching case, first body snatching case in the UK for 50 years. Quite famous cases. Aristocracy had their jewels stolen. It was Swanson sent in. He was quite a famous detective at that point. And as I said, he rose to become superintendent of the CID. So he had a fantastic career, really successful career. And I think if he'd have just been in his retirement, looking back thinking, well, I had a mundane career, but I was involved in the Ripper investigation, I think he would have been probably quite disappointed, but he was much more than that. And Jim Swanson, his grandson, was certainly after some recognition that he was more than the Ripper. And I think, according to the family members I've spoken to, Jim Swanson would have been really proud that this book is finally coming out that does relate his life and career. But I don't know, because obviously Jim Swanson says that Donald was so adverse to police reminiscences and that sort of thing. I think that Donald himself would be just a bit embarrassed and distraught.
He strikes me as quite a humble man.
Yeah, I think he absolutely was. I think he'd have been distraught that I'm actually perhaps putting everything out there, shedding light on what he did. I think he was doing his job.
Yeah.
He was just doing his job, and at the end of the day, that was it. He went home, read his books, wrote his marginalia. And,
does he turn up in films?
He never appeared in a film. He's never appeared in a film.
Who do you think could play it? Which actor do you think could?
Well, I don't know. There was one chap when I first started writing the book back in 2012. There was an advert on UK TV for so long ago, I can't remember what it was for. I think it was some sort of money comparison website. And there was a chap who played Butler, and he looked a spitting image of Donald Swanson, the moustache and hairstyle.
Because the chap he always reminds me of is the chap in the Go Compare adverts.
Yeah, well, maybe not now. Well, maybe in his later career he did, but it's quite similar. But there's there's a guy. It was before the meerkat thing. It was Compare the Market. It was before it came the meerkat, and visually, he was absolutely spot on. And it got to the point where I thought, well, if the book is of interest to people, because I personally think there's so many interesting, varied cases in there, not just Jack the Ripper, it could potentially be a series, and not a good dramatised series. And well, I thought, well, if it ever did happen, that guy would be perfect to play the role. But no, he's never appeared in TV documentary. I don't think he's even mentioned in a documentary.
Yeah.
Really. So
Aberline gets the glory.
Well, I can understand why. I can completely understand
and Swanson
why.
names the suspect.
To be honest, I think Swanson would have been happy with that.
Yeah.
Really, it'd have been, let Fred take all the plaudits and the newspaper cuttings, and I'll just sit here doing my fly fishing and pottering around the greenhouse.
So lastly, most importantly, the book.
Yes.
It's called
Swanson, The Life and Times of a Victorian Detective, and the reason it's called that is because I did a simple biography of, or rather I should say, relate a series of cases of a detective. There's too many police biographies. You pick up a book and halfway through the first page he's already been born and joined the police. And then they effectively retire after a few cases have been related and nothing more is found about them. There's no background information. You don't know the context of the times that these cases took place in. So you could almost retitle the book. It's a sort of a history of the Metropolitan Police. When Swanson joined in 1868, they were still practicing cutlass drill under Sir Richard Mayne as a commissioner. And then when he retired in 1903, fingerprint evidence had come in under Edward Henry. So that 35-year career is a massive amount of change in the Metropolitan Police and the detective methods they had. I think perhaps more than any other period in the Met's history, there were so many changes in detection methods and the types of crime that were going on. So I look into all those things. There's Fenian bombing campaigns of the 1860s and 1880s. There's all the upheaval and the social unrest of Bloody Sunday and other unemployed marches and all the problems that brought to Charles Warren as commissioner. Obviously the Ripper and lots of other unusual cases. And in the middle of all that, you've got Swanson, who's almost sort of tying it together like what would they call a Metropolitan Police blue line going through the whole thing. He was involved in all these cases.
Swanson runs through it.
And that's exactly right. Exactly right. So it's about Swanson, but it's also about the social and historical context of that era. It's a very, very big book, and it's one of the benefits of publishing it yourself. I didn't have someone say you've got to bring it down to so many thousands of words, and it's going to be hopefully an interesting read for people.
Yeah, so it's a passion project as well as a history.
Oh, absolutely right. But I do think that if you want to know who was the assistant commissioner before James Monroe and who wrote this, you're going to find it in this book. Yeah. So hopefully people will enjoy it.
And it's out now.
It's out now.
Fantastic.
Yeah, indeed, in hardback, paperback and Kindle.
And you can get it Amazon everywhere.
Amazon on the mangobooks.co.uk website.
Fantastic. So that's mangobooks.co.uk.
That's it.
Okay. Well, Adam Wood, thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Thanks very much.